Welcome once again, students, to my class of BA Part 1 English Literature. In this lecture, we are going to focus now on Paper 1, Section B. So, I've just shifted from Section A, where we completed British poet William Shakespeare's 3 sonnets and John Donne's Sonnet 2. So, just to bring a little change in the form of poetry we have been reading, I thought of taking up a poem from section B, which includes some of the Indian writers writing in English or their translations. So, welcome to this class, and let's see who is the poet we are going to read, the Indian poet we are going to study in this lecture. So, we are going to talk in this poem about a very popular poet, Indian poet, that is Rabindranath Tagore, born on May 7th, 1861, and who died in August of 7th, 1941, before the independence of India. Rabindranath Tagore was born into a distinguished Bengali family in Calcutta, West Bengal, and he received his education mostly at home. He did not have any formal education, and he was basically taught his mother tongue, Bengali, uh, along with English lessons, and he also went to London for his studies further. Tagore is the only Indian Nobel laureate in literature and considered as one of the greatest Indian writers. And basically, he wrote his poems and other writings in Bengali, and later on, he himself translated most of his works into English. And his works include references from Indian history, philosophy, religiosity, and one of the main theme of his poem or his poems and works were inculcated with the feelings of patriotism, uh, because he was too much concerned about his nation. So, something more about Rabindranath Tagore. He was not only a poet, but he wrote many dramas, so he was a dramatist, and he's also referred to as the Bard of Bengal because he belonged to West Bengal, and Bard means poet. Like for Shakespeare, we say the Bard of Avon in England. Similarly, we have the term Bard of Bengal for Rabindranath Tagore. So, if we just try to see what were his earlier poetic collections, some of them were Manasi in 1890, published in 1890, Chitra in 1895, and Sonar Tari in 1895, in all of which he used colloquial Bengali language instead of the usual archaic literary form. And his poetic collection, termed Gitanjali, was published in 1912, and this work won him the prestigious Nobel Prize for Literature in the year 1913. In the year 1901, Rabindranath Tagore had founded the famous Shanti Niketan near Calcutta, and this was a place which was designed to provide traditional ashram, which also had Western education for students. Rabindranath Tagore presented all his ideals, which were very filled with simplicity of living and the cultivation of beauty, which will be reflected in the works which he created. So, the poem which is prescribed in your course is a wonderful poem, a very small poem, but very impact and powerful. That is, Where the Mind is Without Fear. So, this poem was written during the reign of British in India, prior to the country gaining its independence from colonial rule. And in fact, just after Tagore died, just a few years before India was able to attain its independence from the British rule. So, the country that he was living in at that time, that is in India, as you all know, it was under oppression of the British rule. And this oppression was not simply the physical torture, but also it was a mental torture for the Indian people. And because of this torture, the Indian population started believing that they would never be free from the British rule because they were being badly oppressed by the British rulers. And they were always afraid, the people were always afraid that they would be subjected to by the British administration, torture by the British administration, and they had lost their self esteem and confidence and dignity in themselves as human beings because of this act of the British rule. And their spirit basically had been entirely drained, and they were left with a feeling of pessimism. So, as a result of this, the whole of our Indian nation, as we have studied in our history of Indian national movement, that the states were then willing to fight it out amongst themselves to curry favor with the colonial rulers. So it was a time when individual interest also started propping up, and in order to be in good favor of the British, the states started fighting with each other, and India was in fragments, divided in fragments. So, this poem basically by Rabindranath Tagore, Where the Mind is Without Fear, is a contemplation of a state of being, because that was a time which was something very suffocating for the poet. A place in time, so he thought of a place in time and a way of living into which the author Tagore wishes his country India would awaken to. So, amid that crisis, that confusion, the poet's mind wished through this poem about an India where its people were free of any kind of clutches. And the first 9 lines of the poem present a number of statements in which uh, the starting word is where. These statements are each positive attributes which Tagore is hoping India will achieve. So, a poet is basically a person who is able to, through his imagination, he can put that courage into the hearts of people. And one of the function of this poem, as you read, you will feel filled with that courage. And we can also relate this poem in our current situation too, because though our nation is free from outside British rule, but we do experience and witness the kind of fragmentation that our nation is again gripped with. So, just by reading the lines, powerful, emotive lines by Rabindranath Tagore, we are filled with a feeling of nationhood, where we also can dream of a place that is for our country, a utopian country which is free of all the internal factions which divide our nation today too. So the relevance of this poem is still very powerful for everybody. Let us also try to now see what were some background facts related to this poem and the poet. So, this simplified English language translation of the Bengali poem by Rabindranath Tagore himself is of just 11 lines, but it does not have any rhyme scheme. The original Bengali version of the poem is called Chittu Jetha Bhoishoneo and was published in 1910, before India gained its independence from Great Britain, and was in the midst of protests and demonstrations against British rule. So, when Rabindranath Tagore was composing this poem, his mind was confined by the chains of slavery like any other common citizen of India, because, as I just mentioned, it was under the clutch of the British rule, and freedom was like a far fetched dream. It was like when you are in the midst of a situation which seems to you as impossible to overcome, then at that moment also he was able to conceive of such powerful lines, so that the nation, the people of the nation are empowered and can envision a place where they live freely with freedom and power. So, very important and very powerful poem. This poem is written in the form of a prayer to God, whom Rabindranath Tagore finds is the true bearer of freedom, because it's God who has created all in His image as free beings. When the mind is without fear, as I just mentioned, is a pre-independent poem and an urge or prayer to God to awake his fellow beings for the realization that the essential need to live in a free and united country. He wants his countrymen to awake and enjoy the life of full dignity and honor. So this also plays a very important, like the national movements are of different form, and different um, people had played different roles. Some like who had followed Gandhiji, and they tried to get the freedom from Britishers in a different way. But the poets also played their role, as we can see from Rabindranath Tagore's When the Mind is Without Fear. So, as you can see from the title, you can understand it that the theme of the poem is to invoke a deep patriotic feeling for the country India. And the first 9 lines of the poem present a number of statements which begin with where. And through these statements, Tagore is hoping that India will achieve its freedom. So Tagore wishes in these poems for a country where people's head is held high and knowledge is free. So basically the theme is a utopian feeling, a resolve uh, for having a place where, with the grace of God Father, the country will wake up into that heaven of freedom. So freedom itself becomes akin to freedom as we get in heaven. So the poet's plea for a free India is basically the theme of this poem. Form and tone of the poem. So this basically is a very small 11-line poem and without any rhyme scheme, and it is composed in a very simplified language so that originality seems to exhibit in this translated version, because originally it was written in Bengali. It is in a single set of not very complex lines that goes to the last line of the poem. So it's very simply written, and in fact the entire poem, if you notice clearly in as we read further, the whole poem is just one single sentence broken into different sections with a semicolon at the end of each line. The poet seems to be in a posture of thoughtful prayer, as if it's a reflection or a spontaneous overflow, as Wordsworth states, of powerful feelings. So, whatever the poet has been thinking, has been feeling and experiencing, the torture, the mental clutches, he has been meditating upon it, and when he writes this poem in a flow, he is able to convey his feelings about the situation in which India is during British rule. So, with this, we come to the end of part 1, where we have studied the background of the poet and the poem. And in our next lecture, we will study the poem in detail. Thank you.